He never looked at me like that when anyone else was watching. That was the first thing I noticed about Julian Cross, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it, couldn't convince myself it meant nothing even when every logical part of my brain begged me to drop it and move on like a normal person with a normal job and a normal life. I worked on the 32nd floor of a glass building that reflected the skyline like it belonged to him, which, in a way, it did, because Julian Cross owned half the city and the other half was trying to impress him, and I was just another name on payroll, another badge swipe at 8:57 a.m., another coffee balanced in one hand while pretending I didn't check if he was already in the building before I stepped into the elevator. He was always early, always composed, always distant. The kind of man people described with words like untouchable and precise and controlled, like he had built himself out of steel and numbers and never once looked back. Except he did look back. At me. Not often. Not openly. But enough. It started small, the way things like this always do, subtle enough that I told myself I was imagining it, like the time I stayed late finishing a report no one would read and the office lights dimmed to that soft after-hours glow, the hum of the air conditioning louder than the city outside, and I felt it before I saw it, that quiet shift in the room, that awareness that someone else was there, and when I looked up from my screen, he was standing across the glass wall of his office, not moving, not speaking, just watching, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on me in a way that made my chest tighten, like I'd forgotten how to breathe properly. I looked away first. Of course I did. People like me always look away first. The next morning, he didn't even glance in my direction during the meeting, didn't acknowledge my existence when I handed him the finalized numbers, didn't do anything that would confirm what I thought I saw. And that should have been the end of it, just a trick of light, a late-night illusion, something my tired brain invented to make the hours feel less empty. But it kept happening. In reflections. In passing. In moments when no one else was paying attention. A glance that lingered a second too long. A pause that didn't match his usual rhythm. A look that didn't belong to the version of him the rest of the world knew. And every time I caught it, every time our eyes met in those quiet, unguarded seconds, it felt like stepping into something I wasn't supposed to find, like opening a door that had always been locked and realizing it wasn't locked at all, just hidden. The strangest part wasn't the way he looked at me. It was the way he stopped the second someone else noticed, like a switch flipped, like whatever that look meant had to disappear before it could exist in the open. I started to notice the pattern. I couldn't stop noticing it. Alone, his gaze softened, sharpened, changed into something I didn't have a name for. In public, it was gone, replaced by that polished indifference that made people straighten their posture and lower their voices when he walked by. I told myself it didn't matter, that it couldn't matter, that a billionaire CEO didn't look at someone like me and mean anything real by it. But logic didn't stop the way my pulse reacted, didn't quiet the question that kept replaying in my head every time I caught that hidden version of him slipping through the cracks. Why me? And more importantly, why only when no one else could see it? The silence after he said my name did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had shifted into place without asking for permission, and I realized too late that I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. Because there are moments in life where you expect something small and manageable, and instead you get something that changes the shape of everything around it, something that does not leave room for pretending anymore. I should have responded. I should have said something simple, something safe, something that would push us back into familiar territory where he was my boss and I was just another employee trying to keep my job and my distance. But my voice stayed stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat, like my body understood before my brain did that whatever. It was not supposed to be handled casually. He took a step closer. Not enough to cross any obvious boundary. Not enough that anyone could point at it and call it inappropriate. But enough that the air between us felt different, tighter, charged with something I could not name without overthinking it. His gaze did not waver. It never wavered when we were alone. That was the problem. During the day, his attention moved like precision machinery, efficient, detached, always directed where it needed to be. But here, in this quiet, stripped-down version of the office, it stayed on me like I was the only variable he could not control. I forced myself to speak, my voice coming out softer than I intended, careful, like I was testing the ground before stepping on it. You needed something. It sounded like a question even though I meant it as a statement, something neutral, something that could anchor us back into the roles we were supposed to play. For a second, I thought he might take it, might let the moment dissolve into something normal, something explainable, but instead his expression shifted in a way that made my pulse stumble, subtle but unmistakable, like he was deciding something in real time. "I did," he said, and then he paused, just long enough to make me aware of the space between his words, just long enough to make me wait for something more that did not come. The silence stretched again. It was different this time. Not uncertain. Intentional. He was choosing what to say next, and somehow that felt more dangerous than anything else. Finally, he exhaled slowly, like he was pulling himself back from the edge of something, and when he spoke again, his voice had that familiar calm layered over it, the one everyone else knew, the one that kept things neat and distant and controlled. "The quarterly projections. I want you to revise the third section." The shift was so clean it almost felt unreal, like I had imagined the tension that came before it, like my brain had filled in details that were never actually there. And for a split second I almost believed that was the truth. Almost. But then his eyes lingered again, just for a fraction too long, just enough to remind me that the earlier moment had not disappeared. It had only been hidden, folded neatly out of sight, like something he refused to let exist in the open. I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? And reached for the file on my desk, my fingers brushing the edge of the paper a little too hard, bending it slightly without meaning to. "I will have it done tonight," I said, my voice steadier now, safer, back where it belonged. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched me for another second, quiet, assessing, like he was trying to memorize something again, and then he gave a small nod and stepped back, restoring the distance, restoring the version of himself the world expected. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the office until it was just me again, standing there with a file in my hands and a question in my chest that refused to go away. Because if that was all this was, if it was really just work, then why did it feel like something had almost happened? And more importantly, why did it feel like he had stopped it on purpose? The next day felt like nothing had happened, which somehow made everything worse, because I kept waiting for a crack in the surface, some sign that the moment from the night before had not been quietly erased. But the office moved like it always did, efficient and polished, and completely unaware that something had shifted beneath it. I sat through meetings, answered emails, revised the projections he asked for down to the smallest decimal point, and every time I handed him a document or passed by his office, he treated me exactly the same as everyone else. No hesitation, no pause, no trace of the version of him that had stood a few feet away and said my name like it meant something more. It should have settled it. It should have proven that I read too much into a late-night interaction, that exhaustion and proximity had blurred lines that did not exist in reality. But then came the moment that made it impossible to dismiss. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, in a conference room filled with people who were all trying a little too hard to impress him, voices overlapping, presentations flickering across a large screen, the air-conditioned chill fighting against the heat of too many bodies in one space. I was seated near the end of the table, half listening, half reviewing notes, doing everything I could to stay focused on something that made sense, something predictable. Julian stood at the head of the table, composed as ever, his voice steady, his attention moving from one speaker to another with precise control, and for a while, everything was normal. Then someone asked a question about the revised projections, my revisions, and just like that, his attention shifted to me. It should have been routine. It should have been nothing. But the second his eyes met mine, I felt it again. That difference. That quiet, impossible shift. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else reacted, no one else noticed anything out of place, but I did. I always did now. His gaze held mine a fraction longer than necessary, not enough to be called out, not enough to disrupt the flow of the meeting, but enough that my pulse picked it up like a signal. He asked me to explain the changes, his tone professional, measured, completely in line with the situation, and I did, walking through the numbers, pointing out adjustments, keeping my voice steady even as something in my chest tightened under the weight of his attention. I focused on the screen, on the data, on anything that would keep me from thinking about the way his eyes did not move away even when they should have, even when it would have been natural to glance at the charts or acknowledge the others at the table. When I finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that usually fills with follow-up questions or commentary, but instead he simply nodded, slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable to anyone else. "Good," he said, and then just like that, it was gone. His attention shifted. The meeting continued. The room moved on as if nothing had happened, but I sat there with the echo of that moment pressing against my thoughts, impossible to ignore. Because this time, it had not been private. It had not been hidden behind empty hallways or late hours. It had slipped through in the middle of everything, small enough to avoid notice, but real enough that I could not pretend it was only happening when no one else was around. And that changed something. It meant this was not just a secret he kept in the quiet. It meant he was losing control of it, even if only for a second. And if that was true, if whatever this was could not stay perfectly hidden, then the question was no longer whether it existed. The question was how long before someone else saw it too. Once you start noticing something, it stops being a possibility and starts becoming a pattern, and patterns are dangerous because they force you to choose between ignoring them or facing what they mean, and I was running out of ways to pretend this meant nothing. I tried to pull back. That was my first instinct, the safest one, the only one that made any kind of sense in a situation where the stakes were not equal and never would be. So I started doing small things, things no one else would notice, leaving exactly at 6 instead of staying late, taking the stairs instead of the elevator when I knew he was inside, keeping conversations short and strictly professional even when he was the one asking the questions. It should have worked. It should have created distance, reset whatever invisible line had been crossed, but instead it did the opposite. It made him notice. Not in a way anyone else could see, not in a way that could be pointed at and questioned, but in the subtle shifts I had learned to recognize. The way his gaze would search the room a fraction longer before settling somewhere else. The way his tone would sharpen slightly when someone else answered a question I should have handled. The way he started calling on me more often during meetings as if testing whether I would still respond the same way. I told myself I was imagining that too. I told myself I was connecting things that had nothing to do with each other, building meaning out of coincidence because my brain refused to let this go. But then came the moment that made it impossible to deny. It was late again. Not as late as before, but late enough that most of the office had emptied out, the kind of quiet that felt suspended, like the building itself was holding its breath, and I was at my desk finishing up a report when I heard his voice from behind me, calm, controlled, exactly the way everyone else heard it every day. Noah. I froze for half a second before turning around, already bracing myself for the version of him that belonged to the world, the one that kept everything clean and distant. But the second I met his eyes, I knew I had made a mistake trying to create space. Because whatever this was, it did not fade when ignored. It sharpened. He stepped closer, not too close, never too close, but close enough that I could see the faint tension in his expression again. That same controlled restraint like he was holding something back with deliberate effort. You left early yesterday, he said, and it should have sounded like a simple observation, a neutral comment, but it did not. It sounded like a question disguised as something else. I blinked, caught off guard by the direction, by the fact that he had noticed at all. I had something to finish at home, I said carefully, keeping my tone even, giving him nothing more than what was necessary. He studied me for a second, quiet, assessing, and that look again, that look that did not belong in the space between a boss and an employee, slipped through before he could hide it. You usually stay, he said, softer this time, like he was stating a fact he had been tracking, like my absence from a pattern mattered more than it should. The air shifted again, that same tight, charged silence settling between us, and I felt it, that pull, that awareness that we were standing too close to something neither of us was acknowledging out loud. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to not look away first this time, even though every instinct told me to break it, to step back, to restore the distance that had been there before all of this started. It is just work, I said, and I meant it as a boundary, a reminder, something that would push us back into the structure that made sense. For a second, something flickered in his expression, something sharp and almost frustrated, like he did not like that answer, like it was not the one he was looking for. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar calm, that controlled mask that never slipped when anyone else was around. Of course, he said, and stepped back, restoring the space, restoring the version of himself that fit into the world without questions. But as he turned to leave, his gaze lingered one last time, brief but unmistakable, and this time it did not feel like a secret being hidden. It felt like a warning, because if this was only work, then neither of us would have needed to pretend so hard that it was. It did not take long for the tension to find a new way to surface, because things like this do not disappear when ignored. They evolve, they shift shape until they become impossible to contain, and I started to feel it in the smallest moments. The ones that should have meant nothing but somehow carried too much weight. It was a week later when the rumor started, quiet at first, the kind that slips through conversations in the break room and lingers just long enough to be repeated with more certainty each time. People were talking about him, about Julian Cross, about a possible merger, about investors, about appearances, about how men like him did not just make business decisions, they curated images, and part of that image, apparently, involved a relationship that no one had seen but everyone suddenly believed existed. I heard it in passing, a half-sentence caught between sips of coffee, something about a woman from a well-known family, someone polished, someone appropriate, someone who made sense standing next to him in photos and headlines. It should not have mattered to me. It had nothing to do with me. But for some reason, the word stuck, settling somewhere uncomfortable, like a detail that did not fit into the version of him I had been trying not to understand. I told myself it was just gossip, something people invented to fill silence. But then came the confirmation I did not ask for. It was late afternoon, the office still busy but quieter than usual, that in-between hour where people were finishing up tasks and thinking about leaving, and I was reviewing a report when I heard his voice from down the hall, low, controlled, carrying just enough to be recognized without being fully heard. I did not mean to listen. I really did not. But something in the tone made me pause, made me look up, made me become aware in a way I had learned to associate only with him. I glanced toward the glass wall of his office and saw him standing there, not alone. She stood across from him, poised, confident, the kind of presence that fit perfectly into his world without effort, and the second I saw them together, something in my chest tightened in a way I could not immediately explain. He looked at her the way he looked at everyone else during the day, composed, distant, polite, his expression unreadable, his posture controlled. There was no hesitation, no pause, no shift, nothing like the version of him I had seen when we were alone. It should have been reassuring. It should have confirmed that whatever I thought I noticed before was nothing more than misinterpretation, a projection of something that was never there. But instead, it did the opposite. Because now I had a comparison. Now I could see the difference clearly, without doubt, without room for denial. The way he looked at her was perfect. The way he looked at me was not. And somehow, that made everything worse. I forced myself to look back at my screen, to refocus on the report in front of me. But the numbers blurred, the lines refusing to stay steady, my thoughts circling the same question over and over again. If what he showed the world was real, then what was the version he kept hidden? And if the hidden version was real, then what did that make everything else? I stayed later than I planned that night. Not because of work, not really, but because leaving felt like giving up on something I had not even decided I wanted. And when the office finally emptied and the silence settled in again, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shift in the air. I told myself I was being irrational. I told myself I needed to let this go. But then I heard footsteps again, steady, familiar, approaching from behind, and before I could stop myself, I already knew. I turned around slowly, bracing for the version of him I had seen through the glass just hours earlier, the one that belonged to the world, the one that made sense. But the second our eyes met, that version disappeared, completely, replaced instantly by something else, something quieter, something sharper, something that felt like it was meant to be hidden. And this time, it did not feel like a secret anymore. It felt like a contradiction I could not ignore. The moment our eyes met, I knew I could not keep pretending anymore, because denial only works when there is uncertainty, and there was none left, not after seeing him with her, not after seeing the difference, so clearly it felt almost deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, just like always, that careful distance he never crossed, like there was an invisible line neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching tight between us, heavy with everything that had not been said yet. I should have looked away. I should have ended it there. Let him step back into the version of himself that fit into the world without question. But something in me had shifted, something that refused to let this stay undefined any longer. You were busy earlier, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, controlled, almost neutral, but the words were not. They carried weight, more than they should have, more than they were supposed to. His expression did not change immediately, but I saw it, that flicker beneath the surface, that moment of recognition where he understood exactly what I was referring to without needing clarification. Yes, he said simply, his tone measured, but his eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second. The air felt different again, tighter, like something was pressing against it from both sides, waiting to break through. I swallowed, forcing myself to continue. because stopping now would mean going back, and I could not go back to not knowing. She seems appropriate, I added, and the word felt wrong the second it left my mouth, too polished, too detached, like I was trying to describe something that did not belong in this conversation at all. For the first time since this started, his reaction was immediate. Subtle, but immediate. His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze sharpening in a way that made my pulse spike, not with fear, but with something more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to understanding. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, and his voice dropped just enough to make the question feel personal, like it was directed at something deeper than the surface of my words. I hesitated, because I did not actually know what I thought anymore, only what I had seen, what I had felt, what I could not ignore. "I think," I started, then stopped, because there was no version of this that sounded safe, no way to phrase it that would keep everything intact the way it had been before. "I think that is what everyone else sees," I finished instead, and the second I said it, the silence shifted again, heavier now, more fragile, like it could fracture if either of us pushed too hard. He took a step closer. Not enough to cross the line, never that, but enough that I could feel the change in proximity, the way it pulled everything tighter, sharper, more immediate. "And what do you see, Noah?" he asked, and this time my name did not sound like a secret. It sounded like a challenge. My heart kicked hard against my ribs, my thoughts scrambling to catch up with the weight of the question, because this was it, the moment where everything either stayed hidden or finally came into the open. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, even though every instinct told me to break, to step back, to protect myself from whatever this was turning into. "I see the difference," I said quietly, and the words felt heavier than anything I had said before, more real, more dangerous. Something in his expression shifted again, not hidden this time, not fully, and for a second I thought he might deny it, might shut this down, might retreat back into the version of himself that made sense. Instead, he exhaled slowly, like he had been holding his breath for longer than I realized. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but stripped of something, stripped of the distance he always maintained. "Then you already know," he said, and the weight of those words settled between us, undeniable now, impossible to ignore, because he was not denying it. He was confirming it, and that changed everything. The words settled between us like something final, something that could not be taken back once it existed. And for a second, I just stood there, trying to process the fact that he had not denied it, that he had not stepped away from it, that he had looked directly at me and acknowledged the very thing we had both been pretending was not there. My chest felt tight, not with panic, but with something heavier, something that came with understanding, because knowing something is real is not the same as knowing what to do with it. "You are not supposed to say that," I said quietly, and the moment the words left my mouth, I realized how strange they sounded, like I was pointing out a rule that had already been broken. His gaze did not shift. It never did when we were like this. "According to who?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made the question feel less like a challenge and more like a statement, like he already knew the answer and was waiting to see if I would admit it. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, my fingers tightening slightly at my sides, grounding myself in something physical so I would not get lost in the weight of the moment. "According to everything," I said, and this time I did not try to soften it, because there was no point pretending this was simple. "You are my boss. You are." I stopped, searching for the right word, something that captured the scale of who he was in this world, but nothing felt accurate enough. "You are not supposed to look at me like that," I finished instead, and the second I said it, the silence shifted again, sharper now, more exposed. For a brief moment, something in his expression changed, something unguarded, almost frustrated, like he had reached the limit of how much he was willing to hold back. "I know," he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any explanation would have, because there was no denial in it, no attempt to justify or deflect, just acknowledgement, just truth. And that was the problem, because if he knew, if he understood exactly what this meant, then why had he not stopped? Why had he let it continue, let it grow into something that neither of us could ignore anymore? "Then why did you not?" I started, but the question did not fully form, because I was not even sure what I was asking anymore. "Why did you not stop? Why did you not ignore it? Why did you not treat me like everyone else?" He took another step closer, and this time the distance between us felt thinner, more fragile, like it could disappear completely if either of us moved just a little more. "Because I cannot," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something stripped of control, not reckless, but but honest in a way that felt far more dangerous than anything else. His gaze did not waver, and for the first time, it was not hidden, not softened by distance or circumstance. It was fully there, direct, undeniable. I tried, he added quietly, and that was it. That was the shift, the moment where everything stopped feeling like a secret and started feeling like something real, something that existed regardless of whether it was allowed to or not. My heart was beating too fast now, my thoughts scrambling to keep up with the weight of what he was saying. Because this was not just tension anymore. It was not just unspoken understanding. It was something that had crossed into truth. You cannot just... I started, but the words failed again, because there was no simple way to finish that sentence. You cannot just feel that way. You cannot just admit it. You cannot just stand here and act like this does not change everything. But he did not interrupt. He did not step back. He just watched me, steady, waiting, like he was giving me the space to say what I needed to say, even if it broke whatever this was beyond repair. The city lights outside flickered faintly against the glass, the office around us quiet, suspended, like the world had narrowed down to this one moment. This one conversation that neither of us could walk away from unchanged. And the worst part was, I knew he was right. Because I had seen it too many times now, felt it too clearly to deny it. This was not something he could turn off. And that meant I could not pretend it was. Not there either. I stood there with the weight of his words pressing in on me from every direction, and for the first time since this started, it was not the uncertainty that made it difficult to breathe. It was the clarity, because everything was out in the open now, stripped of excuses, stripped of misinterpretation, leaving only the truth that neither of us could ignore anymore. The city lights outside reflected faintly across the glass, turning the office into something almost unreal, like we were standing in a space separate from everything else, a place where the rules that applied everywhere else did not quite reach. And that thought alone should have been enough to make me step back, to restore the distance before this went any further. But I did not move. Neither did he. You cannot just decide that this is okay, I said finally, my voice quieter now, not weaker, just more certain, because I needed to hold on to something that made sense, something that kept this grounded in reality. This is not something you can ignore the consequences of. He watched me as I spoke, his expression steady, not dismissive, not defensive, just attentive in a way that made it impossible to pretend he was not taking every word seriously. I am not ignoring them, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made me realize he had already thought this through more than I had, that he had been standing in this space longer than I realized. I am choosing to face them. The simplicity of that statement hit harder than anything else, because it removed the last excuse I had been holding on to, the idea that this was accidental, that it was something that could fade if left alone. It was not. It was deliberate. That does not make it easier, I said, and I could hear the conflict in my own voice now, the way it pulled in two directions at once, logic against something I had not wanted to name before. It makes it harder. I finally took a step back, just enough to put space between us again, because I needed it, needed something to remind me that there were lines here that had not completely disappeared. You have a life that everyone sees, I continued, the words coming more easily now that I had started, because once you begin to say the truth, it tends to keep going whether you want it to or not. A reputation, expectations, and I am. I hesitated again, not because I did not know what I was, but because saying it out loud made it feel smaller than it actually was. I am not part of that world. For a moment, he did not respond, and I wondered if that was it. If this was where the reality of the situation would finally settle in, where he would step back and let this end before it became something neither of us could control. But then he moved, not forward this time, not closing the distance, but something subtler, something that shifted the weight of the moment without breaking it. You are the only part of it that feels real, he said, and the words landed with a quiet certainty that made everything else fall away for a second. My breath caught, my thoughts stalling as I tried to process what that meant, what he was actually saying beneath the surface of it. Because this was not just about attraction, not just about something hidden and unspoken. This was about choice, about what he valued, about what he was willing to risk. You are asking for something that changes everything, I said, because I needed him to understand that, needed him to acknowledge that this was not a small shift, not something that could exist without consequences. I know, he replied, and there was no hesitation this time, no pause, no sign of doubt. That is why I am not asking you to pretend it does not. The silence that followed was different from all the others, not tense, not uncertain, but open, like a space waiting to be filled with a decision that neither of us could avoid any longer. I looked at him, really looked at him, not just at the man everyone else saw, but at the version of him that had been hidden in those quiet moments, the one that had never quite fit into the world he had built around himself. And for the first time, I realized something that shifted everything again. He had never been hiding how he felt. Not really. He had been hiding me. And now, standing here with nothing left unspoken, that was no longer possible.